Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1104 escalates the Egghead arc to the next level, and in this breakdown, I'll be going into why Kuma is still able to move, what Saturn's insane regenerative abilities actually may be, what a Buster Call means for the story, and much, much more. But really quick, over 90% of people who watch my channel are still not subscribed. So if you've enjoyed any of my videos, such as the in-depth live action breakdowns or the weekly manga breakdowns, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps to support me and grow the channel, and you'll also be able to get my videos as soon as they come out. So with that said, let's get into chapter 1104. Thank you, Daddy. We pick back up with Kuma's fist heading straight for Saturn while we get a few glimpses of scenes that we had seen throughout the flashback. He remembers his first encounter with Saturn back on God Valley, as well as his time with his father as a slave. We get some scenes of Ginny and a depiction of some scenes in chapter 1098, the one chapter of the flashback that wasn't completely finished due to time constraints, so we're seeing these scenes in the completion for the first time now. The montage ends on a young Bonnie crying while transitioning back to present day with a 12-year-old Bonnie in tears. Saturn is perplexed by Kuma's presence on Egghead, considering that he initiated the self-destruct sequence a few days after he was taken by the Revolutionary Army. We had first learned of the self-destruct switch just 2 chapters prior, but having it be used not too long after Kuma was taken is very interesting, as that would mean it triggered weeks ago from present day. For those interested, let me go into the timeline. We know that the Revolutionary Army clashed with the Admirals at Mary Joie on the 4th day of the Reverie, as we learned from Blackbeard during our first intermission of the Wano arc. When Sabo gives his mission report to Dragon and Ivankov in present day, we learned that the Revolutionaries' attack on Mary Joie took place over a month ago, and this lines up with the Straw Hats' time on Wano, as the Reverie was about to begin just when Luffy and his half of the crew was approaching the island. Back then, they read a newspaper detailing what was likely the prior day's news, including all of the royals arriving before the Reverie. Luffy and his crew would spend 2 weeks on Wano preparing for the raid on Onigashima, and would then spend another week recovering and celebrating their victory. On top of that, they would be on Wano for another few days until they were ready to leave, and would travel for another couple of days after that before finally reaching Egghead. This can all reasonably add up to a little over a month since the Straw Hats arrived on Wano, and since the Reverie began. So this recontextualizes Saturn's line from the previous chapter where he asserts to Bonnie that Kuma is dead. At the time, we took this to be in regard to Kuma's status as a mindless cyborg, but in truth, Saturn had actually thought Kuma to have self-destructed weeks prior. Before he gets an answer though, he gets an armament hockey-infused fist to the face. This sends him flying back into a few structures that end up collapsing upon him, taking Saturn out of the picture momentarily. The immediate aftermath of Kuma's attack on Saturn is of course very reminiscent of Luffy punching Sharlos back on Sabaody. The Marines surrounding the area are in utter disbelief and exclaim that it is unprecedented for an Elder Celestial Dragon to have been hit by a slave. Many fans have been speculating what could go down on Egghead for it to shock the world in a way it never saw coming. Personally, I think we're already there, with Kuma having struck Saturn being such an insane event, but I know some people think things can escalate even further, so I'd love to see in the comments what you think will happen to surprise the world to that extent. We learned from Vegapunk that he didn't install a self-destruct switch, instead opting for something that would turn Kuma into a vegetative state. Once triggered, Kuma's entire body would shut down, leaving him incapable of any action. And so, like I suspected in my previous chapter breakdowns, Kuma's presence on Egghead was not the work of Vegapunk, but rather something else, something innate in Kuma. Vegapunk seems to know about a special property inherent to the Buccaneers, but trails off, leaving us readers in the dark about what this is exactly. Now, there is a lot of speculation on this topic, and we don't necessarily have any great leads. If you've been following my breakdowns, you'll know that I'm a big proponent of the idea that living beings may encode their experiences and instincts within their very DNA or bloodline elements, and that cannot be programmed out. This has been a recurring thing across the Egghead arc, as we first saw with the Mecha Shark, then with S-Shark's battle data, and more recently with S-Snake retaining Hancock's affinity for Luffy. So, despite Kuma having lost his conscious will along with his ability to physically move, he is still acting off something deep within him. And we've sort of seen this in the series before. Back during the Thriller Bark arc, we were introduced to Sindri, Dr. Hogback's zombie servant who once led a life as a famous actress. Hogback was able to animate corpses thanks to Gecko Moria's Shadow Fruit, allowing him to bring life to the dead. And as it was explained by Brook, shadows are akin to a soul. At the time, Chopper was revolted by Hogback's work, as it imposed on the very nature of life and what it means to be human, and so Chopper tried to help Sindri break free from Hogback's control. Sindri, having been moved by Chopper's actions, was ultimately able to resist Hogback's orders. Now Chopper and Robin were puzzled by this, wondering if a soulless body is still able to have its own will, as if something intrinsic to the body was able to break through. Robin wonders if this is something that goes even beyond the scope of scientific research, much like Vegapunk does with Kuma's actions here on Egghead. We've seen that the soul does exist, as evidenced by Brook's Revive fruit, as well as Big Mom's Soul fruit. On top of that, in this arc, we learned that Vegapunk believes there to be some scientific acknowledgement of the soul as well, with a West Blue scholar having discovered the weight of a soul in reference to the real-life 21 grams experiment performed by the physicist Duncan McDougall in the early 1900s. And as a side note, I've speculated before that this scholar from the West Blue could in fact be Dr. Hogback himself. And so, all of this provides a lot of precedent for what we've been seeing from Kuma in this arc. Despite him no longer having any of his will or control over his physicality, he's still able to operate from something deep within him, whether that be his instincts and experiences encoded into his bloodline elements, or what remains of his very soul. But if this is something we've seen from various beings across the series, that still leaves the question of Kuma's Buccaneer heritage and how it plays into all of this. There could be something to how Kuma's people have some physiology that allows them to be more adept at encoding experiences within their bloodline elements, and I say this purely as conjecture, but it may work with the idea that the Buccaneer people have such a close relationship with the history of Nika and pass it down from generation to generation, while most other races seem to have forgotten about Nika completely. Even if we find out how Kuma is able to move despite having lost his will and control over his body, we still need an explanation for why he's here in the first place and why he knew to protect Bonnie immediately upon arriving. I've speculated before that Kuma may be able to share information among his cyborg clones, much like Vegapunk does with the satellites. Esper was present when CP0 declared their intent to kill Bonnie, and on the very next page is when Kuma makes his move, so perhaps this knowledge is what made Kuma act. And more recently, with Vegapunk's suggestion that there's something else going on with the Buccaneers, I've been wondering about Kuma's innate paternal instinct. Could this be what Vegapunk is referring to? Kuma is, after all, named and themed after a bear, an animal known for their intense maternal instinct. Of course, Kuma is an adoptive father, but perhaps there's something here. At this point, I'm just spitballing, so whatever it is, this may be the answer to what makes the Buccaneers' blood so special relative to other people's. And it may have to do with the crime that the Buccaneers committed against the world. If you have any ideas as to what Vegapunk could be getting at here, I'd love to read about them in the comments. Kuma uses the last of his functionality to embrace Bonnie, as she tells him that she understands everything from his memories. Unfortunately, Kuma doesn't seem to be all there, as he looks just straight ahead. Sparks are flying out of him, and he seems to be shutting down or losing his capabilities. He falls to his knees, evoking the imagery of when he first met Bonnie back at the church after Ginny's death. One thing I wanted to address is that when Kuma goes to hold Bonnie, we get a look at his hands, and surprisingly, he's lacking his pads. Now these are a byproduct of his pawpaw fruit and differentiates him from other pacifista. This could just be an error by Oda that gets corrected when published in volume formats. However, there are some interesting implications if this is intentional. We know that he had these when he arrived on the island, as it was explicitly called out by one of the Marines, and we know he had them up until he stopped Saturn, as we get a clear look at them just before he saves Bonnie. But could it be that he lost them between his attack on Saturn and this point? This would mean the devil fruit has left Kuma, which is what happens when the fruit user dies. Could Kuma have used the last bit of life he had to save Bonnie? After all, he is no longer mobile nor responsive after this point, needing to be carried by Atlas. Not only that, the moment he goes to pick up Bonnie is when he's done huffing and wheezing, almost like he can't breathe anymore. I don't know if this is the route Oda is going to go with this, but if it is, this is crazy. It's also interesting to think about where this fruit would respawn. The closest fruits may be with the pile of food that Luffy had in the previous chapter, or perhaps amongst Caribou's stash if he is still on the island. There's also, of course, the Thousand Sunny and Nami's tangerine trees. A lot of speculation to be had, so I'll just leave it at that. Speaking of Luffy, we learned that he was no longer in the area. The two Marines whispering about this are the same ones that were ordered to seize him in the previous chapter, and in my previous breakdown, I went over who I thought might have brought him this food. It'll be interesting to see what develops from this point forward. Anyways, Bonnie and Kuma's reunion is cut short as a shockwave and black lightning emits from the rubble where Saturn was buried. It's not clear if this is supposed to be evoking either armament or conqueror's haki, as black lightning usually does, or if this is something else entirely. I should note that we saw black lightning associated with Saturn earlier in this arc when the pentagram first appeared on the island. Saturn returns to the fray, being depicted very similarly to how his demonic form was presented on his introduction earlier in the arc, though this time, he's missing his left horn and part of his right arm. The horn was likely damaged from Kuma's punch, as it's missing when he crashes into the buildings, but the arm could be explained by having been damaged from the rubble, since he appears to still have it when being blown back by Kuma's punch. Of note, we see black sparks emitting from his head, an interesting contrast to Kuma just a few pages earlier, before he begins to regenerate his horn and arm, while the blood and wounds across his body disappear entirely. We had first seen Saturn's regenerative abilities earlier in this arc when he healed his stab wound and even removed the bloodstains on his beard, but this seems like it's on a different level entirely. We've never actually seen anything like this before. It's not like these parts of his body are regrowing or anything like that, but rather being materialized out of thin air. There are a ton of possibilities here, between it being an ability associated with the supposed immortality the Elders may have, or even a potential advanced regenerative capability of his own Devil Fruit. The fact that his clothes are regenerated as well could be odd, but we've definitely seen a Devil Fruit user's clothes be affected or even generated by Devil Fruit usage throughout the series. And I guess there's also the potential for him to somehow be reversing the passage of time on his body. Now, I go deeper into many possibilities in my 1095 breakdown when we were first introduced to Saturn's abilities, so if you're interested, I definitely recommend checking that out. There'll be a link on screen and in the description. Most of what we were considering back then is probably still in play. However, there is a new piece of information that we received since then, and that's the fact that Saturn is a scientist himself. Over the past few weeks, I've been wondering if some of the black magic we've seen with Saturn is actually just very advanced science. I don't know that this will end up being the case per se, but there are some interesting considerations to be had. We know that there was very advanced technology and science back during the Void Century, as revealed toward the start of the arc, and the world government having remnants of that makes some sense. I'll try and get through these points pretty quickly because the idea may seem far-fetched, but I figured it would be irresponsible of me not to talk about the concept. To start with, Saturn's arrival on the island could be seen as some sort of teleportation or warping technology, something that we've seen from Vegapunk himself. Now, I spoke earlier about the contrast between Kuma and Saturn being depicted with sparks around them all injured, which makes sense with Kuma as a cyborg, but may suggest that there's something going on with Saturn as well. We've dipped into various aspects of modern science fiction that I never thought would make their way into One Piece, from time travel to cloning, and even notions of artificial intelligence and hive mind technology, and at this point, it wouldn't surprise me if Saturn is equipped with nanotechnology or advanced biological materialization. We've seen Vegapunk's research with stem cells and growing organs, but we've also had this particular scene of Kuma back on Thriller Bark, where he fixes one of his wounds from Zoro, and in the manga, this happens off-screen, with the injury being fixed between panels, but the anime goes into the scene a bit more, and makes it look like Kuma is just pulling his clothing over the wound to fix it. There's also Saturn's ability to prevent people from moving. We've just been assuming that this is part of his Devil Fruit powers, but could this be some form of technology as well? Earlier in the arc, we saw Shaka immobilize the Straw Hats with their Dom shoes, which makes me wonder if Saturn is utilizing some greater application of that technology. It's probably a coincidence, but it is interesting that the 4 people we've seen immobilized are all wearing Dom shoes. Bonnie, of course, is wearing them too, but was already captured by Saturn when we first saw this power, while Luffy was the only remaining enemy of Saturn in the area to have been able to move, and of note, Luffy wasn't wearing Dom shoes, as earlier it was made a point that he broke them. I should note though that Vegapunk thinks this may be a Devil Fruit ability at play instead of science. Furthermore, it's curious why Saturn is no longer able to prevent our heroes from moving after he was attacked. I also think it's interesting that Sanji is the one here making note of Saturn's regenerative abilities. Franky and Sanji are the 2 members of the crew who are most closely related to the scientific work of Mads, with Franky having studied Vegapunk's work over the time skip, and Sanji having come from Gerba 66. When the 2 first came to help Vegapunk on the Fabio phase, I was hoping that they'd be able to get some moments to shine and show off their abilities to Vegapunk, but with Saturn being a scientist himself, this could really turn into a battle of science. Franky mentions making it up to Kuma, referring to Kuma having guarded the Thousand Sunny during the 2-year time skip, while Kizaru comments on how much the Straw Hats had grown. Recall that when he met them on Sabaody, Rayleigh spoke of not picking the buds before they sprout, a plant metaphor similar to the one we saw used by Shanks when he stopped Ryokugyu on Wano. And now, Kizaru is here to see just how far the Straw Hats have come. Franky fires a radical beam straight through Saturn. This must be very interesting for Kizaru, as laser technology was created by Vegapunk based on his Devil Fruit powers, and this should be the first time he's seen Franky's post-time skip abilities up close. Lasers are quite rare in the world of One Piece and are capable of serious damage, as seen with Kizaru and Franky being able to pierce the tough exteriors of dinosaur Zoans. It is interesting that Kizaru opted to send Franky flying with a kick after he attacked Saturn, as opposed to preventing the attack altogether. There's been a lot of speculation of Kizaru's motives throughout this arc, whether or not he'll turn coat to help the Straw Hats here. For now, you could potentially read this as Kizaru sending Franky away to prevent Saturn's retaliation. With Kuma having arrived, Kizaru suggests that they should put an end to things quickly, which could also be interpreted as him either wanting to stay ahead of the situation before it turns worse, or perhaps him wanting to get this out of the way so he doesn't have to hurt another one of his friends. When Vegapunk questions Kizaru's humanity, Kizaru coldly responds that he should have worn some darker sunglasses. This can be seen, of course, as him wanting to hide his tears over having to attack so many of his friends, but there is an interesting thematic idea here with the Admirals and their eyes, especially with regard to the impending Buster Call. As we know, Isho chose to blind himself after having seen some atrocities that he didn't care to see, and as we've seen, he is the one admiral who is most explicitly against some of the practices of the world government and the Marines. Of the original 3 admirals, Kuzan and Sakazuki were both present for the destruction of Ohara via Buster Call, and while Sakazuki promoted the carnage, Kuzan saw firsthand that there was something wrong going on. After this, he stopped wearing his tinted glasses, both metaphorically and literally, instead opting to see the world for what it is. And although he didn't go as far as blinding himself like Fujitora, Kuzan replaced his glasses with a sleep mask, almost as if allowing himself some brief reprieve from the horrors he was complacent in and turning a blind eye to the result of the atrocities under his purview from time to time, as we saw with him allowing Robin to live both as a child and as an adult. Also of note, both Kuzan and Isho are the 2 admirals who have allowed the Straw Hats to escape. Sakazuki, as far as we know, has always had his eyes unobstructed, having seemingly understood the world for what it was without issue. Though there is something to be said about his constant harsh and critical gaze. He looks upon the world in terms of good and evil, but we've seen his worldview begin to clash with that of his superiors throughout the post-time skip, with him and his Marines having constantly been undermined and belittled for the sake of the Celestial Dragons. Borsalino, however, is the only one of the original 3 admirals who has not been shown participating in a Buster Call scale event until now, and it's somewhat interesting that he has been depicted throughout his life having gone back and forth with his appearance, at some points donning the sunglasses and other points being without them, which reflects his current disposition of being caught between his head and his heart. He wishes he had darker tinted glasses, most explicitly to hide his tears over his friends, but also as a means to justify his actions here, to further remove himself from the atrocities that are taking place. This is not too dissimilar from Araki, who was also equipped with dark lenses, as well as the twisted rhetoric to justify his cruelty. The admirals form a sort of spectrum, not only with their personal senses of justice and philosophies, but also their tolerance for the horrors of the world. On one end, you have Isho and Kuzan, who have been unable to bear the sight of the world government's atrocities, and on the other, you have Sakazuki, who looks upon the reality he is in without issue. And then, we have Borsalino and Araki, who are only able to view this world within the parameters of their own belief systems, their justifications for why they're doing the things they do. I admit this metaphor may be a little bit contrived, but I just find the tolerance levels the admirals have for these kinds of events very interesting. Saturn, having been pushed to this point, seems to have approved the use of a Buster Call. Earlier in the arc, we had been told that the fleet surrounding Egghead was already much larger than the 5 admirals and 10 battleships a Buster Call typically summons, instead boasting 100 ships, 30,000 sailors, 9 vice admirals, and 1 admiral. This is bound to be an all-out decimation of Egghead. This is also a big departure from Saturn's initial disposition before he arrived on the island. Back then, he still maintained the importance of the mission objectives, York, Punk Records, and the Mother Flame generating power plant. But now, he's bent on eradicating the island over the sake of Luffy, Kuma, and Vegapunk. Surely some of these goals will fall through from all the damage to the island. I wonder how Emu and the rest of the elders will take this development, seeing as Emu personally wanted more Mother Flame. I should mention that there are still Marine and World Government personnel still on the island. Outside of the soldiers on the ground, there are still the Cypherpole agents who were taken hostage by York in the Labo Phase basement. They had expressed gratitude for the Straw Hats for being their savior, but if they realize their lives are being considered forfeit, they may side with our heroes even more. Not to mention the Seraphim are stuck there as well, on top of Lucci and Kaku, though we have seen the Vice Admirals not even hesitate to sacrifice their own men for the sake of the greater mission, Onigumo even having said Lucci could survive all of that gunfire during the previous Buster Call we saw. It feels like we've been building up to this point from the very beginning, with Kizaru having ordered all of the Marines' available manpower to Egghead, and the constant reminders of the importance of Ohara. The destruction of Ohara was the impetus for Dragon to create the Revolutionary Army alongside Ivankov and Kuma, and we've been seeing glimpses of him throughout this arc. I wonder if he's due for an appearance, but we saw him in the previous chapter still in the Kamabaka Queendom, which is located in Paradise on the other side of the Red Line. It took Kuma about a day to get from there to Egghead via flight, so even with some potential Devil Fruit assistance, it seems unlikely Dragon will be able to make it in time. All I know is, it looks like this arc is finally heading toward the end, with an escape by the Straw Hats on the horizon. There are still some unresolved plot threads that will need to be addressed, but I bet a lot of them overlap or are connected. That's all I wanted to bring up for this chapter. If there's anything you'd like to talk more about, please let me know in the comments. If you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for sticking around. Consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. I can't wait to see what happens next week. Thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.